project of the Clean Energy States Alliance. And our topic today is a status update on renewable portfolio standards. And to begin with, I'd like to go over some quick housekeeping. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode. That means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You can select mic and speakers to avoid toll charges if you'd like to join us that way, or you can call in using your phone. And the instructions are on your screen. You will see all that information in your webinar console as well. We would encourage you to submit your questions at any time throughout today's webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will queue up all of your questions and answer them as time allows at the end of our broadcast. And again, just submit your questions as you think of them. Don't wait till the end. And this webinar will be recorded and posted online on our website, as well as a PDF of all of our slides. And you will find that at CESA.org/webinars. And with that, I would like to pass this over to Warren Leon. Warren is our Executive Director here at CESA, and he runs the State Federal RPS Collaborative.
Hey, thanks, Samantha. Well, let me first say a word about the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA. We're a national nonprofit organization that works to implement clean energy policies and programs across the country. And at the core of our organization is a national network of public agencies that are individually and collectively working to advance clean energy. If you could go to the next slide. One of the things we do is we coordinate the RPS Collaborative. This is an effort that is made possible because of funding from the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. And anyone from state RPS administrators to federal agency representatives to any other stakeholder can participate in the RPS Collaborative. And what we do is we advance dialogue and learning about RPS programs at the state level. And we identify best practices. We run monthly webinars. We have a monthly newsletter that talks about what's going on around the country related to renewable portfolio standards. And all those activities are free to anyone, and you're welcome to join. If you could go to the next slide. Let me just go into the topic of today's session and talk about our speaker, Galen Barbose, and we're really happy to have him with us today. Galen and his colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory do the best job of monitoring and tracking what's going on around the country with renewable portfolio standards. Galen has come to the RPS Summit that we do in Washington, D.C. For a number of years, where he does a presentation on this topic that's very well received. And when he did it back at the RPS Summit in September, we realized that not everybody in the world was able to be at the summit, so we should offer the same presentation more widely. So that's what we're doing today. Let me tell you a little bit about Galen. He's a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and he's been there for 13 years conducting research on issues related to renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electric system planning. Among the things he does is he tracks renewable portfolio standards, and he frequently gives briefings to policymakers and industry stakeholders on the design and impacts of those policies. So he's going to today do a presentation that will not take our entire hour, and because of that, it means there will be good opportunity for you to ask questions, and I will then, if you type them in, I'll ask them of Galen. So with that, let me turn it over to Galen for his presentation.
Great. Thanks, Warren and Samantha. Thanks to all of you as well for tuning in here. So as Warren indicated, the purpose of my talk will be to give a fairly broad overview of experiences with state RPS programs to date, with really kind of a substantive focus on several topics: the impacts of RPS policies on renewable energy deployment, compliance with the requirements, and then the cost of meeting these RPS goals. So those are kind of the three main topics. Let's see, here we go. So I'd like to start out here with just a few high-level takeaway messages, and these are essentially the themes that much of the presentation is really oriented around. The first is that state RPS programs have seemingly been a key driver for renewable electricity development over the past decade, alongside, of course, a variety of other important drivers: federal tax incentives, voluntary green power markets, and the like. Going forward, a fairly substantial amount of additional renewable capacity will still be needed in order to meet the kind of out-year RPS targets, looking out to 2020 or 2025. But if we look at the pace at which that additional capacity is needed to be built, it's well in line with the growth rates that we've seen over the past 5 years or so, and in fact there's even some concern within the renewable energy industry about contraction of RPS related demand. In looking at how states have managed their compliance obligations so far, most have done quite well and fully met their interim goals, and in fact a number of states are well ahead of schedule. That said, there are a few states or regions where shortfalls are beginning to emerge. And then finally, compliance costs, which are often the subject of much consternation, have actually been quite modest so far. These costs may, of course, become more of a real issue as the RPS targets ramp up over the coming years. But even then, as I'll show, mechanisms exist in most states to keep these RPS costs under control. So with that, let's take a step back and kind of review the basic RPS terrain. Currently, mandatory RPS policies exist in 29 states plus the District of Columbia. Those 30 policies collectively cover about 56% of total U.S. retail electricity sales. That number accounts for the various exemptions and exclusions that often exist within RPS states, where particular entities, particular utilities, or customers might be exempt from the RPS requirements. In addition to those 30 mandatory RPS policies, there are 7 states with some sort of legislatively established voluntary renewable electricity goal. I won't really be talking about those further in the presentation, but I just wanted to kind of mention their existence. The 30 mandatory RPS policies have been enacted in several phases over the past 2 decades, as shown above the timeline here, where we list each state according to the year in which the RPS was initially passed. As you can see, no new RPS policies have been enacted since 2009. However, the policy landscape has by no means remained stagnant over that period as states have continually revised and refined their existing policies. And that's what we show below the timeline, where we identify which states made some sort of major, typically legislatively established policy revision in each year. Here's just the list for reference of the major RPS revisions in 2014. By far the most significant and perhaps notorious of these revisions was to the Ohio RPS, which was frozen for 2 years. As many of you may know, there have been really kind of a spate of legislative proposals over the past few years to either repeal or roll back RPS programs in some way, as well as a number of court cases. But this bill in Ohio is really the first instance where any of these proposals actually went through. Now, one threshold question when thinking about the success of RPS policies is how much additional renewable energy development have they caused? Now this is kind of a tricky question, this question of attribution, as there are, of course, lots of other factors simultaneously at play that have also helped to drive renewable energy growth. So given that complexity, what can we say on this matter? So one way of approaching this question is just to look at each individual renewable energy project that's been built over time and to attribute it to an RPS if the entity that is receiving power from that project was subject to an RPS at the time that the project was built. And so that's basically what we've done here. And so looking back to 1998, kind of the dawn of the RPS era, so to speak, there were about 10 gigawatts of non-hydroelectric renewable generation capacity online in the U.S. Over the past 15 years, about 75 gigawatts of additional renewable capacity has been built. So essentially, basically an eightfold increase. That's what we show on the left-hand figure, and where we show that about 60% or 45 gigawatts out of that 75 gigawatts could perhaps at least be partially attributed to state RPS requirements. So that just gives some kind of rough sense for how much renewable capacity growth these policies have driven relative to the overall growth in renewable capacity in the U.S. over the past 15 years. By and large, most of the new RPS-driven renewable generation capacity has been wind energy, roughly 80%. That's what the pie chart on the right-hand side shows. However, within the past several years, we've seen solar become a much more significant part of the incremental RPS build, which is what we see on the left-hand figure. And that's occurred chiefly for two reasons. The first being steep reductions in PV costs, mostly related to the modules themselves, which has enabled solar to become significantly more competitive relative to wind and other forms of renewable energy in many regions. And then the second factor underlying this kind of increasing role of solar within state RPS programs is the proliferation of solar set-asides or carve-outs. And that brings us to the next slide here, where we show which states have some sort of solar or distributed generation set-aside. In total, about 17 states plus the District of Columbia have some sort of solar or DG set aside, and several others offer a credit multiplier for either solar or DG. In many cases, these set-aside provisions were added on to an existing RPS policy and were kind of founded on the notion that solar or DG provides some additional value or faces some additional barriers that justify providing an enhanced level of support. So here we can see how the impact of these solar and DG set-asides has really begun to ramp up within the past few years. That's what the stacked bar charts show, which identify the amount of solar set-aside driven PV capacity added in each year. And these stacked bars show just how this set-aside driven capacity has really increased fairly steadily, with the exception, I suppose, of this past year, 2013, where it dropped off a bit due to slumping SREC prices in New Jersey and some other key states. The figure also helps to illustrate just how significant these set-asides have been within the context of the U.S. solar market as a whole, and that's what's illustrated by the two lines superimposed on the figure. The pink line at the top shows that between 60% and 80% of all U.S. PV capacity additions outside of California have been associated with these set-asides. So clearly, at least outside of California, really a big part of the PV market has been driven by these RPS solar set-asides. In the past few years, however, we've also begun to see quite substantial amounts of solar capacity being added outside of the set-asides in order to meet general RPS obligations. And we see that in the figure on the left, where the dark green bar on the bottom shows the solar capacity additions for general RPS obligations over time, and you can see this pretty remarkable spike in 2013, and that spike largely has to do with a slew of large solar projects, mostly PV, but also a couple large CSP plants that were completed in California and Arizona in 2013, and which are being used to meet the general RPS obligations in those states. Aside from California and Arizona, you can see in the pie chart on the right that North Carolina and Nevada both have added quite a bit of solar for their general RPS obligations. Those states also have solar set-asides, but the amount of PV that's being added in those states goes well beyond what is needed to meet the set-aside requirements, and much of it is really being used to meet their general RPS requirements. So there we saw how RPS programs have impacted renewable generation development historically. What about going forward? We estimate that a total of about 98 gigawatts of renewable capacity will be needed to meet RPS requirements in 2020, at which point future demand will grow pretty slowly, reaching about 123 gigawatts way out in 2035. So how much incremental renewable capacity is needed to meet these future targets beyond what's in the ground today? And the answer to that question depends. It depends in large part on how much of the existing renewable capacity is available for meeting RPS demand, given other competing demands for that renewable capacity, such as voluntary green power markets, and given limits to the transmission of renewable energy or renewable energy credits across states and regions. And so depending on one's assumptions about those issues, we're looking at something in the range of about 3 to 7 gigawatts per year needed in order to meet the growing RPS requirements through the end of the decade, and then about 1 to 2 gigawatts per year thereafter. Just by way of comparison, RPS-driven renewable capacity growth has averaged about 6 gigawatts per year since 2008, and total U.S. renewable capacity growth has averaged about 10 gigawatts per year. So at least at the national level, we can see that the required rate of build-out needed to meet RPS targets through the remainder of this decade is similar to or perhaps somewhat below the recent historical pace. And so that's why there's some level of concern within the renewable energy industry of kind of this contracting demand for new RPS resources. And certainly it's clear that that is an issue beyond the end of this decade, but even throughout the rest of the decade, some contraction looks likely. The outlook, however, really differs quite a bit from region to region, and in some cases, much of the incremental demand may be met with projects that are already in the pipeline. And so here, we compare future RPS requirements in each of the 5 regions shown to the amount of renewable capacity in the ground plus the new capacity that's currently under construction or under development. Now, of course, some of the capacity that's under development won't actually get built, and some of what does get built may be unavailable for RPS purposes, but nevertheless, you can kind of get some rough sense here for the gap that exists in each region. And in effect, you can see that the Midwest really has very little incremental capacity needs for its RPS goals. Some moderate level of additional capacity may be needed in the West and in New York, and then some more sizable incremental needs exist in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. Oops. So then what about solar set-aside demand? Here we show the amount of solar capacity that is required to meet solar or DG set-asides over time. Those requirements grow to about 8,000 megawatts by 2020 and then taper off after that. Given existing supplies, this will require solar capacity additions of about 650 megawatts per year through the end of the decade just for meeting these set-aside requirements. And this is somewhat less than the average of about 800 megawatts per year that's been built in the last few years to meet solar set-aside. So kind of as with the RPS requirements more generally, with these set-asides, we're also looking at some contraction in demand for new capacity through the end of the decade and then a pretty steep drop-off after that. So given the substantial growth in RPS capacity to date, one might anticipate that compliance with RPS targets has been relatively high, and in fact that is the case, as we'll see here. So the figure on this slide shows the percentage of the interim year targets in each state that has been met with either renewable electricity or REC. So here we're focusing on just the main tier of each RPS for those states that have multiple tiers or that have set-asides. And the basic trend is that by and large most states have fully met their targets in each year, and that's what's indicated by kind of the nice row of icons lined up along the top of the chart. There have been a few states that have experienced shortfalls, and in particular you can see that most of the New England states have fallen somewhat short of their targets in recent years as the targets in those states have grown and supplies in the region have tightened. Here we have the analogous chart focusing just on solar and DG set-asides, showing the percentage of those set-aside targets that was achieved in each year. Although there are a few states that got off to a slow start, in general the interim set-aside targets have been fully achieved, and really, as we'll see in a couple slides, most SREC markets are currently oversupplied to some degree. So this brings us to the final substantive section of the presentation related to compliance costs. And this issue has really come to the fore in recent years as the targets in many states have risen, and as the whole spate of legislative proposals have been introduced to either freeze or repeal RPS targets, often based on concerns about their impacts on electricity prices and electricity consumers. And so some of you actually may be aware of a paper that LBL and NREL jointly released earlier this year examining RPS compliance costs. The material that I'm going to present here is something of an update to some of the material that was within that report. So it's important to begin by stressing that the way one goes about estimating RPS compliance costs fundamentally differs between restructured states with competitive retail markets and states with traditionally regulated retail markets. In restructured states, compliance is achieved primarily through the purchase and retirement of unbundled renewable energy certificates, RECs. And so compliance costs in these states are in large part a function of REC prices. And so that's what we're looking at here. In the left-hand chart, we see REC pricing trends for each state's main tier or class 1 tier. As you can see, these prices have risen substantially in most of the New England states over the past several years as supplies there have tightened, and have basically been trading at a level equal to the alternative compliance payment rate in those states. In comparison, pricing in the mid-Atlantic states and in Texas has remained quite low due to the surpluses that exist in those regions, though you can see something of a notable uptick over the past year in the mid-Atlantic states, with prices there starting to rise in the neighborhood of $20 a megawatt hour. The figure on the right-hand side shows solar renewable energy certificate, or SREC, pricing trends. And here you can see that prices in many of the key states fell quite dramatically several years back as PV system costs fell and new capacity was added that well exceeded the set-aside requirements in those states. Since then, prices have remained fairly stable, with some states rebounding a little bit, but the key thing to note here is that low SREC prices in these states have really helped to keep compliance costs in check. So here is what we get when we kind of roll up the REC costs and the alternative compliance payment costs across all resource tiers in each of the restructured states. And to allow some comparison across the states, we've denominated these aggregate compliance costs in terms of a percentage of average retail rates in each state. So in other words, you can think about the numbers in this figure as showing the kind of hypothetical rate impact if REC and ACP costs were fully and immediately passed through to customers. So in looking at this graphic, it's evident that RPS compliance costs, they've varied quite a bit, but in general have kind of been, 3% or less if you kind of had to draw a line that kind of captured the upper bound of most of these states. There is, as I said, quite a bit of variation, though, and that variation is driven by differences in RPS target levels across states, differences in REC and ACP prices, of course, and then differences in the mix of resource tiers where, say, for example, states that have relatively large solar set-asides may have somewhat higher costs than other states. Conversely, states like Maine that have very large existing tiers or secondary resource tiers that have low REC prices may have relatively low costs. One fairly consistent trend, though, across almost all of these states is that compliance costs have been rising over time, and that most generally reflects the fact that RPS targets, and thus the volume of RECs and ACPs, are also rising over time. And then, of course, in the Northeast, that dynamic has been compounded by the elevated REC prices over the past couple of years as well. But in general, we are seeing rising RPS costs in these states linked primarily to the rising targets. So now the previous slide dealt with restructured states. What about states with more traditionally regulated retail markets where compliance is generally achieved via long-term bundled power purchase agreements or utility-owned resources? In these cases, there's not usually a REC price that we can observe, and so estimating compliance in these costs ends up being a bit more complicated and perhaps a bit more subjective, as it requires that one stipulate what the utility would have procured in the absence of the RPS and what the costs of those non-renewable resources would have been. And so what we've done here is essentially just leverage RPS compliance cost estimates that individual utilities or public utility commissions have developed in these states using whatever assumptions and methods that they used. And so there is some degree of kind of apples and oranges to these comparisons, but you can nevertheless still get some sense for how compliance costs have varied among this set of states. And in particular, you can see that RPS compliance costs in these states have generally also been kind of at or below about 3% of average retail electricity rates, though again some huge variation. The three states at the upper end of this range, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, those three states have distributed generation set-asides, and you can see in the figure on the right-hand side that those set-asides have seemingly constituted a fairly large fraction of total RPS compliance costs in most years. And the reason there, in large part, is that those DG set-aside costs consist mostly of upfront rebates or performance-based incentives that are paid out over just the first few years of a project's life. So in some sense, the relatively high cost in those three states is partly just an accounting artifact, since those costs are being borne up front for renewable electricity and credits that will be generated over the full life of those DG projects, but the costs haven't really been kind of levelized in any way, so it gives the appearance of relatively high costs. Aside from those 3 states, though, you can see that costs in many of the other states were quite low, well below 1% in many cases, or even negative in the case of Hawaii and Oregon, indicating that in those states the RPS was actually determined to produce a net savings for a variety of reasons. So we've talked about historical compliance costs. What can we say about the trajectory of these compliance costs going forward? As I noted, these costs have been rising in many states. The targets have stepped up in successive years. Those targets are scheduled to continue rising, which will inevitably place some degree of continued upward pressure on RPS costs. And so just to give some visual sense for that dynamic, the figure here compares the RPS target or procurement level for the most recent historical year. Those are the open circles. Compares those procurement levels to the scheduled final year target in each state. Those are the closed circles. And then for reference, we also show the historical compliance cost for the most recent year available in the green bars. And so the extent of the target rise, that is the gap between the open circle and the closed circle, varies quite a bit from state to state. On average, though, we're looking at about a 3-fold increase in renewable energy or REC procurement relative to the levels currently or in the most recent kind of historical year for which we have data. Now, to be sure, there are a whole host of factors that will also impact the trajectory of RPS compliance costs going forward beyond just the increasing target levels. This includes obviously trends in underlying renewable energy technology costs, whether wind and solar costs will continue declining as they have. Future RPS costs will also depend critically on the price of natural gas. It'll depend on what happens to federal tax incentives for renewables, the PTC and ITC. They will depend on environmental regulations. Certainly the EPA's Clean Power Plan is a key one, and I'll kind of come back to that in a few slides. And then last but not least, future RPS compliance costs will depend on the existence and implementation of cost containment mechanisms that are built into many of these RPS programs. So most RPS policies include some kind of cost containment mechanism. These come in many shapes and sizes, which I won't really get into here, but what we've done is taken those mechanisms and translated them into the equivalent maximum possible increase in average retail rate at the peak RPS target level in each state. So it's sort of a worst case scenario, so to speak, and that's what's shown by the red horizontal bars. Looking at those numbers, you can see that for most states, the effective cost cap is below 10% of average retail rates, and in fact, many states have capped costs at less than 5%. So in all of these states, that is kind of in effect sort of the worst case scenario once the RPS target reaches its kind of ultimate level. The figure here also shows actual historical compliance costs for the most recent year in each state. Those are the green bars, just to give some sense for how much headroom each state has before it starts bumping up against its cap. And you can see, particularly among the states on the right-hand side, which rely on some form of cost containment other than an ACP, in those states the cost caps tend to be relatively low, and several of those states are already starting to bump up against their respective cap. And so going forward, I think we can anticipate this becoming a more significant constraint in at least a few states where achievement of the RPS target may increasingly be curtailed as a result of binding cost caps. So that pretty much brings us to the end of the talk here. I'd like to end just by highlighting some of the big issues and big question marks that exist when thinking about the future role and impact of state RPS policies. So first, as I've mentioned a couple times, we've seen a whole host of legislative and legal challenges to state RPS programs in recent years, and so obviously the future of these policies will depend heavily on whether those battles continue to be waged and on their outcome. Second, and this is sort of the bright, shiny object these days, and that's the EPA's recent Clean Power Plan proposal. The threshold question here is what the final regulations will actually be, but even under the draft regs, there are lots of questions about what role state RPS programs might play. Do they become obsolete, or do they become one of the policy tools that states lean on in their compliance plans and potentially take on an even more prominent role than they play today? And regardless, there are all sorts of accounting issues about how the emissions credits will work for out-of-state resources that are used to meet a given state's RPS. So lots and lots of issues there. The third item on the list here is one that I alluded to just on the previous slide, and that's whether and to what extent these cost caps become binding, which in turn depends upon the various kind of underlying issues that impact future RPS compliance costs, which I also mentioned. The fourth item is something of a catch-all, really intended to recognize that state RPS policies don't exist in a vacuum. There are a whole host of other interrelated policy issues that affect renewable energy deployment. And so the ultimate fate of RPS policies and the ultimate impact that they have is very much intertwined with these other issues and parallel efforts that are underway to address those other interrelated issues. And then finally, there's kind of the policymaker X factor. As we've seen historically, states have frequently made revisions to their programs, often to correct things that weren't working well or to make the targets more stringent. And so certainly we would anticipate that trend to continue, really with the big question mark here being what states will do once they start approaching their terminal targets at the end of the decade, and whether we'll start to see some significant number of states revise their RPS targets upward for kind of the next era of state RPS programs. So with that, I want to thank all of you for your attention, and I guess I'll just point you towards the resources listed here. The URL at the top, rps.lbl.gov, is kind of a little bit of a clearinghouse website that we've created where we post a lot of our RPS-related material. Certainly this talk will be there. There are some data files there and various RPS-related reports for folks that are interested. And then the other URL here is just for our general renewable energy publications page that has not only RPS-related material, but all sorts of other stuff as well. So with that, I will hand the mic back to Warren for the Q&A session.
Hey, Galen, thanks. You certainly covered a lot of territory in a short amount of time, and unsurprisingly, it's generated a lot of questions, and let's go through them. First, can a single solar installation meet both a general RPS requirement and a set-aside obligation?
So in general, well, I guess in general the answer is yes, though one can't double count a megawatt hour. So a solar facility generates a certain number of megawatt hours, and each megawatt hour can be applied either to a general RPS obligation or to a solar set-aside obligation, not both. That being said, a given facility could sell some of its credits into solar set-aside markets and some into general RPS markets. In practice, though, SREC prices are almost always higher than general RPS REC prices, and so if you are an owner of a solar facility and are generating RECs, I think you would typically prefer to sell into the market where you can make more money.
Good. Is there any research on whether carrots or sticks are more effective in achieving RPS targets or goals?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I guess, I mean, RPS policies, I suppose by their nature, are kind of a stick in that they entail placing a mandatory obligation on an entity and potentially imposing penalties if it fails to meet that RPS obligation. So I would say, you know, by their nature, RPS programs are more of a stick. That being said, states certainly have coupled RPS programs with other kinds of policies that might be deemed sort of more like a carrot. And I guess the most obvious example of that would be for solar and PV. Many states offer rebates for individuals or businesses who invest in solar, and those have been used often in conjunction with an RPS and are one way of sort of bridging that carrot-stick divide.
Good. In your table where you look by region at the amount of renewable energy that was under development, excuse me, does underdeveloped mean projects actually in the process of getting built, or does it just include projects that are in the utility queue that have gone listed with utilities that may actually never enter the construction phase?
Yeah, so on that slide, I don't think I have control over the slide deck anymore. Oh, there we go, perfect. You can see that there are sort of, well, 3 bars, but there's the light blue at the top and then kind of the medium blue below that. The medium blue is renewable capacity that's actually under construction. So that's kind of the most certain of that new capacity. The light blue, which is simply called under development, that's a very, very broad kind of category. These numbers actually come from SNL Energy, and to be honest, I can't recall exactly what criteria they used to define under development, but I would assume that it includes basically any project that has issued an announcement. So that's a pretty low bar, I would say, and as a result, I would assume that you know, in all of these cases, some significant fraction of the light blue bars won't actually get built.
Okay. While you're moving around through the slides, if you could go to slide 23, where you looked at costs in states that have not been restructured. It seems like, can you explain why the numbers for New Mexico, for example, seem different in the right-hand graph than in the left-hand graph?
Wow, we had somebody listening in with a very discerning eye. The reason for that is that there are actually somewhat different utilities underlying the data points on the left-hand versus the right-hand graph, and that it's actually explained in the footnote to the figure there, where we say that data for New Mexico in the left-hand figure includes 2 utilities, Southwest Power and Public Service of New Mexico, in all of the years shown, but then the data in the right-hand figure is based only on SPS, and that's because we only had sort of the cost data for the DG set aside specifically for SPS, and so we were only able to kind of break out the total costs for that one utility.
Okay. And somebody else who was looking at your slides very carefully asked, why wasn't California included on either of your tables about RPS cost impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually, in retrospect, I wish I would have included a California-specific slide here, because it is sort of a special case. So in California, neither the utilities or the PUC have published an estimate of incremental RPS compliance costs. They've published sort of gross procurement costs, which is something different. And it's just really kind of the total number of dollars expended on renewable energy procurement, not really the net cost. Then both the PUC and the utilities have published their own independent estimates of the avoided costs. And so the incremental cost or the net cost, which is what we're showing on this slide, is kind of the difference between the two. And so because in California there are kind of these two semi-dueling estimates that are out there, we didn't include them in here. I will mention, though, that depending whose numbers you use, either the PUCs or the utilities, you get vastly different results. In the case of the PUC's numbers as the basis for the avoided costs, they use the all-in cost of a combustion cycle gas turbine facility. And using that as the basis of avoided costs, they determine that the net cost of the RPS procurement would actually be negative. In other words, there's a net savings overall. The utilities, on the other hand, for their avoided cost estimate, they've used just the wholesale spot market prices from the California ISO's market. And using that as the basis of avoided costs yields a very large and positive net cost, somewhere on the range of, I think, about 6% of average retail rates. So it's illustrative in that it really shows how much the underlying assumptions and methods can matter for these regulated states. But it's also hard to really know what to conclude about the actual costs in California, given that the two estimates that are out there are so wildly divergent.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, let me ask a couple of broader questions that people have written in. One person writes, as costs for renewable energy continue to come down, do you think that an RPS is the best policy for the post-2025 era? Or can renewables compete on their own? And if they can't compete on their own yet, how do we determine when renewables are ready to fly on their own?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think whether or not, and the extent to which renewables are able to fly on their own, it depends on a number of things beyond just kind of the cost trajectory of renewables per se. And in particular, it depends on what happens to federal tax incentives. It depends upon other environmental regulations that may make renewables more competitive. And then it also varies quite a bit by region and by renewable energy technology type. So, there are parts of the country where wind energy right now, with the production tax credit, can compete very well head-to-head against natural gas-fired generation without an RPS. Now, even if the PTC kind of goes away permanently, that still may be the case. It may be maybe less prevalent, but there still may be pockets where wind generation, for example, can still compete head-to-head. The same is not true in other parts of the country, nor is it necessarily true for other kinds of renewable resources that haven't kind of descended down the cost curve quite as much as wind. So unfortunately, I think my answer, which is always deeply unsatisfying, is it depends, and it really varies from case to case. But I would say at this point we're not yet to the point where we can really say that RPS programs have outlived their purpose.
Yeah. Well, if I could also add one other comment on top of that, one theoretical way in which RPS programs are self-correcting as a policy mechanism is if we got to the point that the renewables were completely cost competitive with more conventional generation, well, then the electricity suppliers would just not be paying a premium for the renewable generation they'd be contracting with. They'd still be needing to meet the target, but there would be no net cost of doing that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Warren. That's a great point, and I mean that's yeah, exactly.
So we had a couple people wrote in asking, with other questions, asking you to look at the future. And one person says, look, a number of states have targets or goals that expire in 2015. Illinois, Michigan, Montana, New York, Wisconsin, and in the case of goals, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. Do you have a sense of what's next for those states? And also another person wrote in, hey, you have any prognosis for state RPSs in light of the elections this past week in some of the states that have RPSs?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any great prognostications, I think by virtue of the fact that I don't really kind of track kind of political processes or discussions very closely. You know, I think certainly the political climate surrounding renewable energy has become more kind of complicated and more sort of fractious in recent years, and I think I expect that climate to continue to some degree. I think the only thing that really might be an important countervailing force would be if the EPA's 111D regs do go forward in something close to the form proposed, then the onus will sort of shift to a significant degree to state regulatory bodies, clean air regulators and public utility commissions, to figure out how to comply. And in doing so, it's possible that some decisions may be made about renewable, about RPS programs and renewable energy more generally that might be somewhat insulated from the political process. Now, I mean, of course, that's never completely the case. PUC commissioners are appointed or elected, and so are certainly very aware of how their decisions might be perceived in the political sphere. But I think that there's probably greater potential for kind of more stringent or tightened RPS requirements as things move into kind of the regulatory sphere and out of the political sphere.
Yeah. Well, thank you on that one. Let's focus in on some more specific questions again. And one person asked, is a significant amount of non-RPS renewables development related to similar purchasing rules such as federal facility mandates for renewable consumption, or is the non-RPS renewable development not linked at all to any sort of policy mandate?
I would say that so much of the non-RPS renewable growth is linked to voluntary green power markets. So this would be, you know, utilities that offer green power pricing programs for customers that are willing to pay a premium, or green power purchases by large commercial entities or by the federal government. And so there's, I don't have the numbers or know them off the top of my head, but certainly a pretty significant fraction of renewable growth and renewable demand is associated with those sorts of voluntary and really kind of market-based programs. Aside from any sort of mandatory federal purchasing, most of that is really just sort of done voluntarily. And then aside from that, many utilities, especially in the West and Midwest, practice integrated resource planning. And we've certainly seen quite a few cases where utilities are procuring renewables via their IRP process. In some cases, those utilities don't have an RPS and they're procuring renewables because they make sense anyway. In other cases, utilities have an RPS that are doing IRP and they end up procuring more renewables than they need for the RPS because additional renewables just made sense on the basis of cost and risk. And those IRP processes are in some sense kind of a derivative of policy mandates in the sense that there are typically sometimes statutes, but more often regulations that exist that kind of direct utilities to conduct their IRPs in certain ways that may be sort of more favorable towards consideration of renewable resources.
Okay. And somebody writes, does your modeling take into account, and I was assuming the modeling has to do with the modeling on costs, does it take into account banking rules in RPS states?
Yeah, I would need to, I mean, for the cost calculations, it didn't explicitly take banking rules into account, but I suppose implicitly it did because we don't really care whether the RECs that were retired in a given year were generated in that year or banked from a previous year. But
okay.
Yeah, so I'm not. I think I would need to know a little bit more about what specific element of the analysis was being referred to there.
Well, in this case, and in the case of any questions I don't get a chance to ask Galen in this webinar, you should feel free to email him and ask him as a follow-up. There's time for a couple more questions, and I'll give Galen an opportunity to say anything else he wants to say. One question is, have you read and what do you think of the recent Union of Concerned Scientists analysis headline, states can produce twice as much renewable electricity as EPA calculated?
I have not read it, so unfortunately I can't comment on it.
Okay. And
I will, though, however, maybe just make one perhaps related comment, which is that, you know, the EPA's targets were based on these building blocks, and the renewable energy building blocks were kind of, as I understand it, based on these sort of regional benchmarks. Now, of course, many states have RPS targets that are in excess of the regional benchmark, and WEC, the Western Electric Coordinating Council, did some preliminary analysis recently looking at sort of what would happen under their kind of reference case scenario and where each state would get relative to the targets, the emission targets in the EPA draft rule. And there were many states in the West, at least, that just under business as usual will exceed the renewable energy building block level that the emissions target was based on for that state. So I think clearly, just based on the RPS targets that are in place today, I think it's apparent that many states not only can, but will, under business as usual conditions, exceed the renewable energy generation assumptions that were built into the EPA's analysis.
Good. Well, I have two more questions I'm going to ask. One's very specific. Can you explain whether RPS standards are set simply as a percentage of electricity sales, or do they also account for transmission and distribution losses?
They are generally set as a percentage of retail electricity sales. So it's kind of, it's a little bit of a mix and match since the numerator is energy sort of delivered to the bus bar at the transmission level, and then the denominator is electricity consumed at the customer meter. But I think that's just sort of measurement-wise, I guess that's an easier way to do it, and so that's how most states have done it.
Good. And could you touch finally, on the differing prices for various sources of supply, under the assumption that a electricity supplier will select the lowest cost RECs, does that put some technologies at an advantage over others?
I mean, it can, and that's partly why some states have developed these sort of different resource tiers within their RPS so that particular kinds of renewable resources that currently are higher cost than others, but that might be deemed to either have special sort of non-monetized value or that might be sort of necessary in the long run and therefore worth providing some differential level of support for. So that's part of why we've seen kind of these different resource tiers emerge in different states, and in particular the development of solar and DG set-asides.
Good. Well, going back to the previous question, the person who wrote in, I think, clarified that was, I think, thinking about this issue of T&D losses in relationship to your modeling of costs. Has that been factored in?
No, though I guess I'm not still immediately clear what it would mean to factor it in. I mean, I guess for for regulated states where the costs are based on avoided non-renewable generation costs, those non-renewable generation costs, they're all sort of denominated at in terms of electricity delivered to the bus bar level. So there's no sort of additional transmission and distribution savings, really. I suppose the only case would be for distributed resources that are being used to meet RPS targets. And in those cases, there may be some transmission and distribution cost savings. That's an issue of great debate, and unfortunately is sort of one of these very, very sort of idiosyncratic issues that depend upon the particular system that you're looking at and where exactly it's placed on the transmission or distribution system. As far as I know, though, I mean, the utilities that have DG set-asides, when they calculate the kind of net cost of those resources and net off any avoided costs, I assume that they include transmission and distribution losses when calculating those avoided costs. I do not believe, though, that in general they include avoided transmission and distribution capacity costs.
Oh, interesting. Well, in any case, is there anything else, Galen, you want to tell to the audience before we break for the day?
No, nothing other than just I want to thank everybody again for tuning in and for your questions. Those were actually all really great questions, and hopefully I answered at least most of them satisfactorily. If folks are interested in following up, please feel free to contact me. My email address was included on the last slide in my talk, and of course feel free to check out any of the resources that we've posted online as well. And then last, thank you, Warren and Samantha, for organizing and hosting this and inviting me.
Well, as always, you were clear, articulate, and had a wealth of information, and the webinar recording and the slide deck will be posted on our website at www.cesa.org/webinars. I hope folks will join us for more RPS collaborative webinars in the future months. Thank you very much today for coming.